The Dream Eater, Part 1. The Sleepless Man. Dr. Emily Carter sat in her small office, tapping her pen against the wooden desk. The dim yellow light from the lamp made the room feel warm, but outside, the city was covered in darkness. She checked her watch. It was almost 10 p.m., and she was about to see her last patient for the day. His name was Daniel Reeves. He was different from her other patients. Most people came to Emily because they couldn't sleep, had bad dreams, or were afraid of the dark. But Daniel's problem was much stranger. "I don't sleep," he had told her during their first meeting. "I haven't slept properly in years." Emily had seen many patients with sleep disorders, but something about Daniel was unusual. His eyes were deep and hollow, like he had stayed awake for years. His skin was pale, and he moved slowly, as if his body was tired but his mind wouldn't let him rest. Tonight, he walked into her office, wearing a long black coat. He sat down in the chair across from her. "You haven't been sleeping again?" she asked, opening her notebook. "I close my eyes," Daniel said, his voice soft, "but I don't sleep. I just watch." "Watch what?" Emily asked. Daniel took a deep breath. His fingers trembled slightly. "I see dreams that don't belong to me. I enter the nightmares of others. I feel what they feel, see what they see." Emily frowned. "That sounds like lucid dreaming. It happens when someone is aware that they are dreaming." "No," Daniel whispered. "It's not my dream. It's theirs." Emily leaned forward, studying his face. "Whose dreams?" Daniel hesitated, then looked straight into her eyes. "Anyone near me. Strangers. Friends. Even you." Emily felt a strange feeling in her stomach. She wrote something in her notebook. "And what happens when you enter these dreams?" Daniel licked his dry lips. "I feed." The room became silent. Emily felt her heartbeat slow down. "Feed," she repeated. Daniel nodded. "I eat their nightmares. I take their fear. When I wake up, they don't remember their bad dreams. But I do. I remember everything." Emily didn't know what to say. She had never heard of such a thing before. It sounded impossible, but Daniel truly believed it. "Does it help them?" she finally asked. Daniel gave a weak smile. "Yes. Their nightmares disappear. But every time I feed, the world around me feels less real. As if the walls, the streets, the people are all fading." Emily stared at him, unsure of what to say. Daniel leaned closer. His voice was almost a whisper. "And now, I think I have taken too much." Emily felt the air grow heavy around her. She had treated many patients with strange sleep conditions, but this was something new, something dangerous, something she did not understand. Dr. Emily Carter sat in silence, staring at Daniel Reeves. His last words hung in the air like a shadow. "I think I have taken too much." Her fingers gripped the pen tightly. The ticking clock on the wall was the only sound in the room. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "What do you mean, Daniel?" she asked. Daniel's lips parted, but he didn't speak right away. His eyes, dark and hollow, flickered toward the window. Outside, the city streets were empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. "It's hard to explain," he finally said. "I don't just take the nightmares, Emily. I absorb them. I pull them into myself." Emily swallowed. She had dealt with many unusual cases in her career, but this was something else entirely. "And what happens when you absorb them?" Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples as if his head ached. "At first, nothing. Just memories, flashes of other people's fears. A woman drowning in black water. A child lost in a maze with no exit. A man trapped in a burning house, his screams never ending. It used to fade after a while." He lifted his tired eyes to hers. "But now the nightmares don't go away. They stay with me. They whisper to me. And I think they are changing me." A shiver ran down Emily's arms. "Changing you how?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel shifted in his chair. He looked over his shoulder, as if expecting something to appear behind him. "The world feels different. Less solid. Sometimes, when I reach for things, my hands pass through them. The other day, I looked in the mirror, and for a moment, my reflection didn't move." Emily wrote quickly in her notebook, her pulse quickening. "That could be exhaustion, Daniel. Severe lack of sleep can cause hallucinations, loss of coordination." Daniel shook his head. "No, it's not that." Emily set her pen down. "Then what is it?" Daniel hesitated, his fingers digging into his knees. "Something is wrong with the way I see reality. It's like I'm slipping between dreams and waking life. Sometimes, I hear voices when no one is around. I see things in the corners of my eyes, shapes that vanish when I turn my head. And last night..." He stopped. His face looked pale, almost colorless. "Last night what?" Emily pressed. Daniel took a deep breath, his fingers trembling. "Last night, I saw something in my room. I don't know if it was a dream or real, but it was there, standing at the foot of my bed." Emily felt a strange, cold sensation spread through her chest. "What did you see?" Daniel's voice was hoarse. "It was me." Emily frowned. "You mean your reflection? A shadow?" Daniel shook his head. "No. It was another version of me. An exact copy." He stood there, watching me with my own eyes. His face was blank, empty, like something pretending to be me but not getting it quite right. Emily's heartbeat thudded in her ears. Daniel swallowed. And then he spoke. The room felt smaller, the air heavy. "What did he say?" Emily forced the words out. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He said, "Stop feeding before it's too late." A cold silence stretched between them. Emily could hear the faint hum of the city outside, but in this moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Emily leaned forward. "Daniel, do you think this figure was part of your subconscious? A warning from your own mind?" Daniel's eyes flickered to hers. "I don't know. But I do know one thing. When I looked into his eyes, I felt something I have never felt before." Emily hesitated. "And what was that?" Daniel licked his dry lips. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I felt that he was real." A sharp knock on the office door made both of them jump. The sudden noise shattered the stillness of the room. Emily turned her head toward the door, her heart pounding. She glanced at the clock. It was past 10:30. No one else should be here. Daniel sat frozen in his chair. Another knock. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Emily swallowed. One moment, she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. She stood up, walking toward the door. Her hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before she turned it and pulled the door open. The hallway outside was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered weakly. The long corridor stretched into darkness, the shadows seeming deeper than before. Emily stepped out, glancing left and right. Nothing. She turned back toward the office, but just as she reached for the door, she froze. There was someone standing inside. Daniel was still in his chair, stiff with fear. But behind him, standing in the dim glow of the lamp, was a figure. Tall, motionless. It looked exactly like Daniel. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The figure slowly turned its head toward her. Its face was Daniel's, but its eyes were not. They were deep, black voids, empty and endless. The air in the room seemed to ripple, like the walls were bending, warping. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if examining her. And then, in a voice that was both Daniel's and something else entirely, it spoke. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Emily's mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her body was frozen in place. The lights flickered again. And then, everything went dark. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the lights flickered, then went out completely. The silence that followed felt suffocating, like the very air around her was holding its breath. She could hear her own shallow breathing, the faintest sound of her feet shifting on the floor as she tried to move. But she couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure standing behind Daniel. The darkness in the room was thick, almost liquid. Emily reached out blindly, her hand brushing the cold metal doorframe, desperate to feel something solid. But there was nothing. Just the unsettling sensation of the world around her warping, shifting, as if reality itself was bending. The figure didn't move, yet it felt like it was watching her. She could feel its gaze, even without seeing its eyes. Her pulse raced, and she tried to force herself to speak, to break the silence. but her voice refused to come. "Daniel," she finally managed to whisper, her throat dry and tight. The real Daniel, the one sitting motionless in the chair, didn't respond. But the figure, the one standing behind him, spoke in a low, eerie voice that sent a chill down her spine. "You are not supposed to be here," it said, its voice now an echo of Daniel's, yet somehow twisted, unnatural. "None of you are." Emily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to back away, to leave the room, but something held her there. She could feel the weight of the figure's presence, as if it were rooted in the very air she was breathing. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling, barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it took a step forward, its feet making no sound on the floor. The air grew colder, and Emily could see her breath fogging in the darkness. She looked at Daniel, his pale face now frozen, as if he had turned into a statue. Then, with a sudden movement, the figure reached out and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Emily gasped as she saw the shadows shift, swirling around the figure like a cloud of smoke. It was as though the figure wasn't entirely solid, like it was made of darkness itself. The more the figure touched Daniel, the more his body seemed to fade, his form becoming translucent, as if he were slowly melting into the air. "Stop!" Emily cried, taking a step forward despite her fear, her voice trembling. "You're hurting him." But the figure simply smiled, and it wasn't Daniel's smile. It was something much darker, much colder. "I am not hurting him, Emily. I am freeing him," the figure said. "He was never meant to exist in this world. He's a dream, a shadow of a nightmare that should have never been." Emily felt her stomach twist. "A nightmare?" The figure nodded, its smile growing wider, though it was more of a grimace than anything else. "Daniel is not what he appears. He is a creation, a thing born from the fear of others. And now he has fed for too long. Too many nightmares have been consumed, and the line between dreams and reality is thinning. The more he feeds, the weaker reality becomes." Emily's head spun. She couldn't make sense of the words. "What are you talking about?" "Daniel is real," she said, her voice rising in desperation. He's just a man. He's a patient. He's not." The figure raised a hand, and Emily's words stopped in her throat. The air around her tightened, as if the walls were closing in. "Daniel is not a man, Emily," the figure said, its voice now laced with a cruel laugh. "He is the Dream Eater, a being that should never have walked in this world. He was born from the nightmares of the lost, and now he consumes them, until there is nothing left, until all that is left is darkness." Emily's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other as she tried to understand. "But if he's feeding on nightmares, how is that?" The figure interrupted her with a low chuckle, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. "You don't understand," it said, its tone almost pitying. "He feeds on fear, Emily. But each time he takes a nightmare, it takes a piece of reality with it. The more he feeds, the more the world fades. What was once solid becomes fragile. What was once real becomes a dream. And now, the dream has become the nightmare. Emily took a step back, her mind spinning. No, that's not possible. He's just a man. Is he? The figure asked, its voice growing cold, almost amused. Look at him, Emily. Look at what he's become. Emily turned toward Daniel, her heart sinking as she saw him. His form was flickering, like a candle's flame in the wind. He wasn't entirely there anymore. His body was barely visible, like a ghost, his edges fading in and out of focus. He was becoming something else, something less than human. No, no, Emily cried, rushing to his side. She reached out to touch him, but her hand passed right through him, as if he were made of smoke. Daniel's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, they were his, desperate, terrified. But then they darkened again, becoming those of the figure behind him. Help me, Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible, a crack in the air like a breaking glass. Emily froze. Was it truly Daniel speaking, or was it the nightmare speaking through him? Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, the walls warping, the air twisting around her. The world itself felt like it was breaking apart. The sound of whispers, distant and frantic, echoed in her mind. Strange images flashed before her eyes. People she didn't recognize, all of them trapped in their own nightmares, their faces twisted in fear. Daniel was fading more rapidly now, his form barely visible. The figure behind him stretched out its hands, its shadow growing longer, swallowing up the last remnants of Daniel's body. Emily tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure turned toward her once more, its expression unreadable. You can't stop it, it said softly. It's already too late. The nightmares have won. Emily's heart raced. The room felt colder than ever, and the walls seemed to bend in on themselves. She looked at Daniel's fading figure one last time, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. And then, everything went black. When Emily's eyes opened again, she wasn't sure how long had passed. The darkness that surrounded her felt thick, like she was submerged in an endless void. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, her hands brushing against something cold and unfamiliar. She was no longer in the therapy room. The walls were gone, replaced by a vast, empty space that stretched endlessly in all directions. The air was still, yet heavy with an unnatural weight. It felt like she was floating in the middle of nowhere. She took a deep breath, her mind racing. Was she dreaming? Had it all been a nightmare? But no. She could still feel the coldness on her skin, the emptiness pressing against her. It was real, but it didn't make sense. Daniel, she called out, her voice trembling in the vast silence. The word felt strange on her tongue, like it didn't belong here. She waited for a response, but there was nothing. The emptiness swallowed her words whole. Suddenly, a figure appeared before her, stepping out of the shadows. It was a woman, tall and pale, with long dark hair that seemed to float around her head as if caught in an invisible breeze. She wore an expression that was both sad and knowing, as if she had seen too much. Emily froze, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw something familiar in them. Something human. "Where am I?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked slowly toward Emily, her movements graceful and deliberate, almost as if she were gliding across the floor. Emily felt a strange pull toward her, a need to understand what was happening. "This place," the woman said softly, her voice like a distant echo, "is the space between dreams, the place where nightmares are born." "Nightmares?" Emily repeated, confusion flooding her mind. "But I was just in the room with Daniel. And the figure, what was that thing?" The woman's expression softened, but there was a hint of sorrow in her gaze. "That was the Dream Eater," she said. "And you are here because of him." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's happening? Where's Daniel? What's happened to him?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering just in front of Emily's face. Slowly, the air around them began to shift. The shadows in the distance seemed to grow darker, swirling like a storm. The woman's hand began to glow faintly, and with it, the darkness receded, revealing flashes of images. Flashes of Daniel. But they weren't the Daniel she knew. They were images of him, twisted and distorted. His face was contorted in terror, his body writhing, as if trapped in a nightmare. Emily could see the nightmare's shadow stretching over him, consuming him whole. His screams echoed in her ears, but they weren't real. They were memories, not of the man she had treated, but of something else, something much darker. "You see," the woman continued, her voice strained, "the Dream Eater feeds on the fears of others, but in doing so, he becomes something else. He loses pieces of himself, pieces of his reality, until he is no longer human. He is a shadow of nightmares, a creature born from the fears of others. The more he feeds, the more the world bends and warps, the more the line between dreams and reality blurs." Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she watched the images of Daniel twist and distort before her. "But why me? Why am I here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The woman's eyes narrowed, and Emily could see the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions in them. "You were meant to help him," she said, her tone soft but firm. "But now you are caught in the web he has spun. You've seen too much, and the nightmares are coming for you, too." Emily took a step back, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean, coming for me?" "You've already seen the cracks in reality," the woman explained. "The more you stay here, the more the world around you will slip away. The more you see the truth of what Daniel has become, the more the nightmares will consume you. It's only a matter of time before they find you. To find me? Emily repeated, her voice shaking. What do you mean? I don't understand. The woman looked at her with pity. You're already in it, Emily. You've crossed into the realm of the Dream Eater. You've seen the truth, and now there is no going back. Every dream he consumes, every nightmare he takes, weakens reality a little more. And as reality fades, it will take you with it. Emily's mind raced. She had to get out of here. She had to stop this. Stop Daniel before it was too late. But how? How could she fight something like this? How could she fight a creature that fed on nightmares, that twisted reality with every step it took? The woman seemed to sense Emily's panic. You can't fight it alone, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. But you're not alone. Not yet. There's still time. You can still stop him, but you have to act fast. How? Emily demanded, desperation creeping into her voice. How do I stop him? The woman's gaze hardened, and she took a step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. You must find the heart of the nightmare, the place where his darkness began. Only then can you free him and free yourself. But beware. Time is running out. The more he feeds, the less chance you have. With that, the woman disappeared into the shadows, leaving Emily alone in the vast emptiness. The silence was deafening, and the coldness of the air pressed down on her like a weight. She could feel it, the pull of the nightmare, the consuming darkness that was now inside her, twisting her thoughts, warping her sense of what was real. She had to find Daniel. She had to stop him before it was too late. But where would she begin? How could she possibly find the heart of a nightmare? Emily's heart raced as she stood in the empty void, the air thick with a sense of dread. The shadows seemed to close in around her, and the whispers of the nightmares she had seen began to echo in her mind. The woman's words played over and over in her head. You must find the heart of the nightmare, the place where his darkness began. But how? Where was the heart of the nightmare? And how could she possibly stop the Dream Eater? She looked around, her eyes scanning the endless darkness. Nothing made sense. The space was both infinite and crushing, as if the very fabric of reality had been unraveled. There were no landmarks, no paths to follow, only the oppressive blackness, swallowing everything in its path. It felt like she was drifting in a sea of nothingness, each breath pulling her deeper into the unknown. But she couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. She had to stop Daniel before the darkness consumed him completely, and before it consumed her as well. Without thinking, Emily began to move, her feet carrying her forward despite the weight in her chest. Her steps felt hesitant, but she forced herself to walk, to think, to act. She couldn't let herself be swallowed by fear. Not yet. There had to be something, some clue, something to help her understand how to stop this nightmare from taking over. As she walked, The shadows seemed to shift around her, undulating and curling like smoke. She felt as though the very air was alive, suffocating her with its oppressive weight. The images of Daniel, the twisted, distorted version of him, kept flashing in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of him, trapped in a nightmare that he had become a part of. The more she thought about it, the more the edges of reality seemed to blur. She could no longer tell if she was awake or still trapped in some terrible dream. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the air, vibrating beneath her feet. The ground beneath her shifted, and Emily stumbled, nearly losing her balance. The darkness seemed to ripple like water, and in that moment, she felt the unmistakable presence of something. Someone nearby. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice shaking. "Is that you?" There was no answer, only the deafening silence that followed her words. But then, just as she was about to call out again, a figure materialized in front of her. It was Daniel, or at least it looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his body was slumped in a way that made him seem smaller, weaker. He looked lost, as if he had been pulled into this nightmare and was struggling to find his way back. "Daniel!" Emily gasped, rushing forward. "It's me, Emily. I'm here to help you." But as she reached out to him, he recoiled, his eyes wide with fear. "No, you don't understand. You can't help me. I'm already gone." Emily stopped, her heart sinking. "What do you mean? You're still here. You can come back, Daniel. We can fix this together." His expression twisted in agony, and for a moment, she thought he might say something else, something that could give her hope. But instead, he turned away, his shoulders shaking. "I can't. I've fed too much. The nightmares have consumed me." Before Emily could react, Daniel collapsed to the ground, his body twitching as though he were in the throes of a terrible dream. His skin began to ripple, and the darkness around him seemed to pulse with energy. The air grew thick, and the ground trembled beneath her feet as though the very world was being torn apart. It was as if the nightmare itself was fighting back, trying to swallow everything in its path. "No!" Emily shouted, stepping forward. She reached out to touch Daniel, to pull him away from the darkness that was consuming him. But as her hand neared him, the world around her began to distort, the space warping like a broken mirror. The air grew colder, and the shadows thickened, closing in on them both. For a moment, Emily thought she might be lost forever in the nightmare. The edges of her vision blurred, and she felt a sickening pull in her chest, as if she were being dragged down into an abyss. But just as she thought all was lost, a sharp, piercing light cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene before her. A figure appeared in the distance. Another woman, but this one was different. Her eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and her face was a mask of calm determination. She moved toward Emily with a quiet grace, as though the very shadows bent around her. "Who are you?" Emily asked, her voice filled with both fear and relief. What's happening? What is this place? The woman's gaze never wavered. I am the keeper, she said simply, her voice echoing in the vast emptiness. And I am here to help you. Help me, Emily repeated, confused. How can you help me? Daniel, the keeper's gaze softened. Daniel has become what he feared most. He has fed too much on the nightmares, and now he is a part of them. But there is still a chance for him to return. Emily's heart raced. How? How can I save him? The keeper extended her hand, and a swirling vortex of light appeared in front of them. Inside the vortex, Emily could see a faint, flickering image of Daniel, his distorted face filled with terror. The darkness seemed to crawl over him, swallowing him whole. You must find the source, the keeper said, her voice steady. The heart of the nightmare. The place where it all began. Only there can you undo the damage that has been done. Emily nodded, her pulse quickening. She had to find it. She had to stop this before it was too late. The keeper's eyes gleamed with a strange intensity. But be warned, Emily. The deeper you go into the nightmare, the more you risk losing yourself. The line between reality and dream will become more fragile, and the cost of failure will be high. Emily swallowed hard, but there was no turning back now. I'll do whatever it takes. With a final glance at the keeper, Emily stepped forward into the vortex of light. The shadow seemed to close in behind her as she plunged deeper into the nightmare, determined to find the heart of it and save Daniel, no matter the cost. Emily felt herself falling, the darkness around her twisting and shifting like an endless sea. She tried to focus, to steady her mind, but it was impossible. The further she fell, the more fragmented the images around her became. Faces, places, and voices flickered like distorted memories, only to be swallowed by the growing void. She had never felt so alone. The shadows seemed to reach for her, clawing at her skin with an icy touch, whispering threats that sent a chill deep into her bones. The air felt heavy, thick with an oppressive force that pressed in on her from all sides. She couldn't escape the sense that she was being watched, hunted, by something far worse than she could imagine. And yet, she couldn't stop now. She had to push forward. For Daniel. The light from the keeper's vortex had faded as she fell deeper into the nightmare, leaving her alone in the suffocating dark. But ahead, there was a faint glow, a pulsating light that seemed to hum with a strange energy. Emily moved toward it, her footsteps slow and deliberate as she navigated the shifting, unreal landscape. As she approached, the light began to take shape, slowly revealing a massive, twisted tree at its center. Its gnarled branches stretched high into the air, twisting like the limbs of some ancient creature. The trunk of the tree was blackened, as though burned by some unseen fire, and the leaves shimmered with an eerie, almost liquid sheen. The air around the tree was thick with a heavy presence, the same dark force that had been following Emily since she arrived. Emily hesitated. This was it, the heart of the nightmare. She could feel it deep in her bones, the very source of the darkness that had consumed Daniel. But she didn't know what to do. How could she stop it? How could she undo the damage? A sudden rustling from behind her snapped her out of her thoughts. She spun around, her heart racing. But there was no one there. The shadows shifted unnaturally, curling in on themselves like living creatures, closing in on her. Then, out of the darkness, she heard a voice, familiar, yet warped, twisted by the nightmare. Emily, it was Daniel's voice, but it was different. It was distorted, hollow, like a version of him that was barely alive. Daniel, she called, her voice trembling. Where are you? I'm here to help you. We can end this together. The voice echoed around her, bouncing off the dark walls of the nightmare. Help me? You can't help me. I'm already lost. No, Emily screamed, her voice breaking. You're not lost. You can come back. I won't let this take you. The shadows swirled, and suddenly, Daniel's distorted figure emerged from the darkness. His face twisted in agony. His eyes were wide and empty, like two black holes, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream. His body was shuddering, as though he were fighting something inside him, something terrible that was trying to consume him from within. Emily took a step forward, but before she could reach him, a powerful force threw her back, slamming her against the twisted tree. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a deep, black void below. She gasped for air, struggling to stand. The nightmares around her began to take shape, manifesting as horrifying creatures that clawed their way from the shadows. They were like nothing she had ever seen. Freakish, grotesque, with eyes that burned with hatred. They were all around her now, circling, watching her every move. You think you can stop this? Daniel's voice came again, but this time it was louder, filled with a sense of dread that made Emily's blood run cold. The more I feed, the more I become part of this place. You can't save me, Emily. There's no way out. Tears burned at the corners of Emily's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she was so close. I'll find a way, she whispered to herself, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Suddenly, the creatures lunged forward, their claws reaching for her. Emily moved instinctively, dodging to the side just in time, her heart pounding as she struggled to keep her balance. She couldn't afford to let them touch her. Every time they did, the darkness would grow stronger, and it would be harder to escape. She had to keep moving. As she stumbled through the twisted landscape, she caught sight of something. Something that might just be the answer she was looking for. In the distance, there was a door, floating in the air like a mirage. The light from the door was faint but unmistakable. It was her way out, the key to ending this nightmare once and for all. She pushed through the fear, forcing her legs to carry her toward the door. Behind her, the creatures continued to pursue her, their claws scraping the ground with a sound that made her skin crawl. But Emily didn't stop. She couldn't. The door was her only hope. As she neared it, the ground beneath her feet began to crumble, breaking apart as if the very world were falling apart. The nightmare was collapsing around her, and she felt a sense of urgency like never before. She had to reach the door before it was too late. Just as she reached out to touch the door, a cold, familiar voice echoed through the darkness. Emily, Daniel's voice again, but this time it was softer, quieter, almost pleading. She turned around, her heart sinking. Daniel was standing there, his form flickering in and out of existence like a ghost. His eyes were filled with a deep sorrow, and for the first time, she saw the man she loved, truly saw him, trapped in the nightmare, fighting to hold on. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt you." Emily's heart shattered as she reached out to him. But before she could say anything, the world around her seemed to collapse completely. The door disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The creatures were closing in, their claws just inches from her. It was too late. She had failed. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, she felt something. An overwhelming sense of light, of warmth, like the sun rising after a long night. The shadows recoiled, and the creatures screeched, backing away from the light. Emily turned toward it, and there, in the distance, she saw the keeper. She was standing tall, her arms raised toward the sky, the light flowing from her like a beacon. "Emily," the keeper called out, her voice carrying across the void. "It's not over yet. You can still save him." Emily's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance. She had to act, and she had to act now. With everything she had left, she charged toward the keeper, ignoring the nightmares that still circled her. The light grew brighter, and Emily felt herself pulled toward it, towards the one thing that could save them both. She couldn't waste another second. She had to make it to the keeper. Only then could she stop the nightmare and save Daniel from the darkness that had claimed him. That's the end of the story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thanks for watching.